Hello and welcome everybody, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon. We are so excited to have you join us for this particular webinar where we are discussing the results from our PALCUS Index 2017 National Survey. It's the first survey that we have conducted, that PALCUS has conducted, and we believe that it is also the very first truly national survey of the Portuguese-American community, looking at a lot of different issues. So as opposed to maybe just education or just the immigration experience, we really tried to get a read on a lot of different issues within the community, how people felt about things, what were the issues that were important to them, where did they spend their time, their charitable giving, that sort of thing. And the purpose for that is so that this survey can actually serve as a resource for Portuguese organizations nationwide who are looking for new ways to engage their membership, attract new members. Things change over time, people's interests change over time. So how do the different organizations come up with new and different things to do to keep their membership engaged? And so that's really one of the big reasons that we did this survey. And we do hope to do it on a regular basis so that we can see how things change over time. And of course, we wanted to work with one of the foremost experts in research that we know, who is our research consultant, Dr. Dulce Maria Scott, and from Anderson University. So welcome, Dulce. Thank you so much for being here and also for all your work on the survey. It was amazing.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank you to everyone that's joining this webinar. When Angela came and talked to me about doing this survey, I was very happy and immediately agreed to enter into it because, as she said, there is basically very little information about Portuguese Americans. The Census Bureau has data on demographic and socioeconomic variables, also on when people arrived in the United States, as well as where they are living in the United States. But there is nothing, for example, on Portuguese American public opinion. And one of the things that this survey does is to begin to try to figure out how Portuguese Americans feel about different things. Mm-hmm. So the survey data also does not distinguish between not the survey data, the census data also does not distinguish between generations in the United States. They give data on people born in Portugal and then give data on all the Portuguese Americans that live in the United States. So they put everyone together. So if we want to see how things have changed from generation to generation in the United States, we really have no data on that. And with this survey, we are able to ask people what generation of their family was first arrived in the United States, and then we can correlate that variable with other information that we asked to see mm-hmm. how things changed from generation to generation. So as they say, information is power, mm-hmm. and in order to make informed decisions and then informed action, Portuguese American leaders and other stakeholders can do much better with information about who we are and the challenges that we face in this country. I do not want to neglect some studies that have taken place of Portuguese Americans. For example, at the national level, the citizenship group that was doing studies on Portuguese American citizenship and political participation. They did a very good job, and they showed, like our survey shows as well, that Portuguese Americans have a very high rate of participation, political participation in this country. I also did a survey in 2011 that had similar questions to this, but not all the questions that this survey has, etc. And then there are other studies at the local level, single issue studies, and so on. But we really have very little information about Portuguese Americans as a whole, and I really commend PALCUS for taking this initiative and then for inviting me to participate in it with the survey committee.
Excellent.
So should I keep going? Or?
Yeah, just before we do, I just wanted to say thank you to our sponsors, because this is a huge effort, and it does require a lot of time and data cleaning and everything that goes into making sure that the data is viable and that the survey is done the right way. And so we did have some financial contribution from our sponsors here on the page: Rhode Island College, UMass Dartmouth, FLAD, and also PFSA, and then the resources contributed by Anderson University, as well as yourself, Dulce. So I just want to make sure we recognize, and as we move forward with future surveys, we hope to have a lot more logos on this page, because I think in order for this to be truly a national collaborative effort, we need to work with as many organizations as possible. So for those of you, yes.
And that was the next point, is that the survey, the reason that I added census information to the report is because the survey is not entirely representative of the Portuguese-American population. In particular, we are missing people at lower levels of education. And moving forward, I have some ideas that I'm going to present to the committee on how we could draw a more representative sample. And to do that, it takes more time and resources, and that's why I agree with you that we need more sponsors in order to use more representative techniques of doing surveys.
Right. Okay. So let's jump into the data. I don't know if you want to go over some of the methodological. Sure.
Well, could I just also say that what both the survey and the census data show is that we are a very well integrated group in American society. We are an old immigrant group, we are accepted, but that very integration brings about some challenges for our community that we can talk about later. So why don't you go through some of the data then?
Okay. And this PowerPoint is actually already available on our website for those of you that actually want to read all of the bullet points. If you go to palcus.org and then select PALCUS Index from the programs menu, it is there. And then we will also be providing a recording of this webinar on the website as well. So if we get into just some of the demographic information of those who responded to the survey, obviously most of them, more than half, were born in the United States, but then, we have a large population that is still Portugal born, right?
And other countries. So
yeah.
We have a lot of Portuguese immigrants coming in recently are actually not from Portugal, but they are, say, from France. They may have been born in France of Portuguese parents, or from Brazil, from other areas where there are Portuguese immigrant communities. They may immigrate from there to the United States as well. And we also have people that were born in the African territories, in Macau, and so on. And but those, and that's more common recently, that more people are coming from those areas than Portugal itself. Well, I don't know if it's more people, but more than used to be.
Okay. And when we look at the generations that have arrived, we have, I think to your point about us being a very integrated society, we have everything from immigrants to fifth generation and beyond, right? I mean, we've been here a long time.
Yeah, and then for the analysis, I collapsed the fourth and the fifth and beyond generations just to have more cases.
Right. Just a quick look at who responded to the survey. California showed up in force. Proud of my people in California. And then you included some information here on the right with states with 10,000 or more Portuguese Americans, which I think is really interesting because people probably would not have thought that, say, North Carolina had a large Portuguese population, and 10,000 is actually considered considerable, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's the states, that data is provided by the Census Bureau.
Right. So, okay, let's move on to the next one. And then again, just, people that participated, these are the cities that they were in most frequently. Again, some of the cities in California showed up the most, obviously, but again, with our improved methodology next time, we hope to have a much more even spread next time.
Yeah, also, that question was optional, so a lot of people did not answer it.
Okay, good to know. Women showed up in force for the survey as well, so we had more women that answered than men. But, generally 50-50, almost.
However, the census data shows that we have a gender imbalance in the Portuguese-American communities, because we have 48% that are male and 52% that are female. So there's a 4-point difference in and this is from the Census Bureau. So our survey to be equal to the Census Bureau data, you'd have to have 48% male and 52% female.
In a lot of the data that you have in comparing to the Census Bureau data, it's actually nice to see that even though if our numbers are slightly different, they're in the same trend, right?
Yeah.
So it's a good validation point that our the survey data we collected is actually accurate as well. Just one more data point to validate that. So it's always good to see. Just to look at the age demographic of people that answered, and it's just to point out again that this survey was conducted mostly online through Facebook and through our newsletter. So of course you're going to get a little bit of a younger demographic because those are the people that are online. And so again, next time we will be doing some in-person interviews, going out to the clubs and the churches and making sure that we get a wide age range represented in the survey. Okay, marital status, pretty straightforward. Any comment here? No? This one I thought was interesting about whether or not the spouses were of Portuguese descent. I feel like I expected that there would be a bigger discrepancy, but it's, again, about 50-50, right?
Yes, and I suspect that in areas like in New England, where there's a very tight concentration of the Portuguese community, of Portuguese people, that just by happenstance, that if someone is going to marry someone else, that person might be Portuguese. So I think that because a lot of our respondents were from California, and the Portuguese population is much more spread out in California, it's a much larger state than Rhode Island or Massachusetts, that perhaps that's the reason that there's such a high number of people that are married outside of the group. And that probably that percentage is lower in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and perhaps even New Jersey.
And then ethnicity of spouse by generation?
Yes, and this is, we see that as the generations succeed each other, we are much less likely to be married to someone that's Portuguese.
Right.
There's a very noticeable decline.
Right. And then level of education. I feel like this stat was interesting for a lot of people that I've talked to so far about the survey. And I know that you did some comparison with the Census Bureau data as well. Do we have that? Yeah, I think here we go.
No, actually, this is by place of birth.
Oh, okay. So we can do this one first if you like.
Well, move to the generations. So we captured an education. Well, go to the census slide and then come back to this one. Move one forward.
That one? Okay.
Yeah. So we captured a group that's highly educated. The people in our survey have education rates similar to the Asian American population in this country, which we know is very well educated. So when we do this again, we'll then try to get a more even spread in terms of the education of Portuguese Americans. But Portuguese Americans have made a lot of progress in terms of education. And again, we don't really know, because we can't separate the generations born here from the immigrant generation, exactly how much progress there has been. But over the years, we've gone from, say, 22% of us that had college degrees, and now it's almost at 30. That have college degrees, and that's a good thing. But we still are not at the same level, say, as the Italians or the Irish. But we have to keep in mind that we are a more recent immigrant group than they are, the Italians and the Irish. So our percentage of people that are foreign-born is much higher than the percentage of those groups that are foreign-born. And like us, those were groups, the Irish and the Italians, that came here with low levels of education, primarily to work in factories and land and provide cheap labor. So we really can't compare the educational achievement of the Portuguese with groups that arrived with very high levels of education, like the most Asian populations are arriving today. But our progress in reality has been similar to the progress that Italians have taken in history, and as well as the Irish. Those populations did not become educated overnight. It took a few generations for them to catch up, and we are catching up very fast with them. Our immigrant population, as I said, has very low levels of education, but because immigration now is really at low levels and our immigrant population is aging, I do think that there will be a jump in the statistics, a very significant jump on the level of the education that is shown for Portuguese American in the census. So we really aren't different from these other groups. The studies that have been done of groups that have arrived in the United States with low levels of education and destined to the low-skilled labor market, that those groups took about 3 or 4 generations before they caught up in terms of educational achievement.
And we're on track with that.
Yeah, we are on track with that.
That's good. Yeah, I do find that more and more families are stressing the importance of education in the community. So I think that's definitely accurate, and also good to know that, when comparing ethnic groups, you have to look at similar size, similar demographic.
Right.
Like you said, it's hard to compare to, and for example, the Asians.
Yeah, and similar characteristics that the immigrant population brought with them when they arrived. Right. So we can really compare Portuguese Americans to even Jewish Americans who arrived with much higher levels of education. And historically, the Italians used to be put down because they arrived at the same time as most of the Jewish population, and the Jews were advancing much quicker in education than the Italians were. But the Jews were arriving already with high levels of education, and no one was taking that into consideration when comparing the groups. And so we also need to take that into consideration when we talk about Portuguese Americans.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on. Current employment status. So I was actually happy to see that we have quite a few that are self-employed. So we are an entrepreneurial community, it seems.
Yes. And what is interesting is in our survey, there were several business owners, and the largest business had 10,000 employees.
Wow.
And then the second largest had 3,000 employees. Only 6 of them had more than 100 employees. There were several with 75, 50, 40, 30, and then several really small ones. So we need more data on Portuguese American businesses. In fact, that could be another study that PALCUS does, a survey of Portuguese American businesses. But I was impressed that we are a population that is to a very high percentage involved in business. Not only here in our survey, but also the census data shows that.
Excellent. I don't know if we need to go through this in detail, but it's really just detailing the segments, the industries where people are working. Yeah. And I think this just demonstrates that we're everywhere. right?
Yeah.
We're not just in agriculture or construction, like some people might want to believe. We are actually working throughout a lot of different industries.
Education, healthcare, government,
etc. And again, these are just some really detailed, these are the detailed answers people had to choose from. So for those that want to go through these slides in detail and see what the options were, you can do so afterwards. And if you have any feedback on, should we change some of these? Is there some category we should add? Anything like that, please do so.
Yeah, we'll look at that later.
Yeah,
it's good to simplify things.
Then income. So similar to the education, this survey with the respondents we had showed a higher level of income, I think, compared to what had been done in the Census Bureau. Is that correct?
Yeah, somewhat higher, because we have people that are business owners with 10,000
right.
employees, and there's people that that have high levels of education. So we had a lot of professionals, business owner, executives, and so on that answered this survey. But this chart here is from the Census Bureau, and it shows that we are very highly educated. Hold on, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
My computer is running out of battery and I had forgotten to plug it in. So I'm plugging it in. So it shows, this is the one indicator where Portuguese Americans shine the most. We are, in terms of household income, we are over $10,000 higher than the average for the United States. In terms of family income, we are like almost more than $11,000 higher than the average for the United States. And the difference between these two figures is that the family income is just of families. The household income includes everyone, single people and so on, and that's why it's considerably lower than the family income. And I was then looking at other groups. I looked at the Greek, the Italians, and the Irish. We are doing better than the Irish are in terms of income. And we're slightly lower than the Greek, and we're slightly lower than the Italians, but basically we are at the same level as the old established immigrant groups that began to arrive here in the 19th century. And that's amazing. I am so amazed at this. And then I also provided a little bit of the differences between states. And it's interesting to see that Florida and Rhode Island are considerably lower than Massachusetts and New Jersey and California. Mm-hmm. I think that New Jersey is so high because New Jersey is a suburb of New York, basically, right?
Okay.
And this is truly amazing. And that even though we are somewhat lower than the Irish and the Italians and the Greek in terms of educational achievement, that in terms of income, we are right up there with them and even doing better than the Irish.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
So in our survey, people had even higher incomes than that, but actually not much higher. Got
it. So now we move into language, and later on we'll talk about how maintaining the language emerged as a very important issue for our community. But so there was a clear trend here, right, as far as language skills and how that has evolved in our community?
So this first slide asks of everyone that participated, regardless of what generation they are in the United States. And as you can see, writing skills are lower than speaking skills. Mm-hmm. And we are the primary way in which we learn the language, or the language is transmitted to children, is teaching at home. And generally teaching at home, we don't teach writing, we just teach speaking.
Right.
So here you see the decline from one generation to the other. Yeah. So the immigrant generation still speaks Portuguese to a very good level, a very high level. And then the 1.5, and here 1.5 is defined as children who arrived with their parents from the ages of 5 to 13. And then under 5 is I consider it second generation. And the reason is that it's more where you raised than where you were born in this situation.
Okay.
So you see a sharp decline from the immigrant generation to the next generation and so on. So it's difficult to transmit the language across the generations, and we can talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
You can move to the you can move to the next chart.
This one I thought was interesting. A lot more people, I expected most people to be using it at some point in their job, but it turns out that, well, I guess it's some of the time, quite a few people, but half people say they never use it, which I thought was interesting.
And again, it's possible that people in Massachusetts and Rhode Island use it more frequently than people in California. So
right. That's true. Very true. If we were asking about Spanish, that might the numbers may have been a little higher. Okay. This one I think is pretty self-explanatory. We have such an established community here that English-speaking skills is no surprise, right?
And the Census Bureau says that only 8% of Portuguese Americans indicate that they speak English less than very well. So it's linguistically, we are very integrated into American society. Right.
This one, I was not surprised with these stats at all. It's hard to get the children speaking Portuguese. I find that a lot of children understand, but then to actually continue speaking it, it's a constant challenge for even those that are very, very fluent, I find. So this is very similar, I think, to the other graph.
And so this question aimed more at the transmission of the language to the children. And this is, again, not different from other groups in the United States. The studies have shown that by the generation of the grandchildren, only 1 to 3% speak the language of their ancestors. And the 3% is actually the Hispanic population, because when it comes to the Asian populations, it's from 1 to 2%. But in the border areas between the United States and Mexico, over there, 13% of the grandchildren, speak Spanish. But throughout the rest of the country, the Spanish population, only 3% of the grandchildren speak Spanish. And so it's similar with us. And some people ask, why is it that we are not transmitting the language, the maternal language, to the children? And some people blame the United States government. When we think about it, we have always been an assimilationist society. You look at the Statue of Liberty and what it says there. People come here and they become Americans. And to become an American, you have to speak English. In the 1960s, we became more multicultural, but even today, people say you come to America. In America, you speak English. And there's the English-only movement. So although we've become a more multicultural society, we still really are for assimilation. People demand that if you come to this country, you should speak the English. On the other hand, I also think that what you were saying about it being very difficult for our children, it's difficult to operate entirely in 2 languages, and very few people can do it. I have friends who are totally fluent in English and totally fluent in Portuguese. They write academic articles in English, but when it comes to writing literature, they can only do it in Portuguese. And that's because that's the language of their inner being. And so most people even if they become bilingual, it's just a partial bilingualism that they acquire. They may know enough to go to another country and travel there and get around there. And then within Portuguese America, and as you saw, the main method of transmitting the language is at home. We are not transmitting to our children a professional vocabulary. So, we are transmitting for the functions of an intimate type of relationship within the household. And so even if you know Portuguese to communicate within the household with your parents and so on and grandparents, you don't have enough vocabulary to go out there and be a professional in Portuguese.
Right.
And that's extremely difficult. It requires a very intentional effort to keep up with two languages. And so at most we can get some level of proficiency for some linguistic functions, but not for all of them.
Right.
But it's a worthy effort. Portugal has been and FLAD and the foreign ministry have been very invested in promoting Portuguese in the United States. We have excellent people across the United States teaching in secondary school, in universities, and we should really promote the language among our children, because if there's one group of people in the United States that you'd be interested in learning Portuguese, it should be our children. Although, of course, others are also interested. And I've spent a lot of time and resources with my son, one of my sons, the one that's in college right now, and he's majoring in engineering and physics. And there, as you know, the economy has become increasingly global. And one of the companies that's over here, this is just an example. One of the companies that's over here is Rolls-Royce North America. And they produce airplane engines, for example, and they have lots of investments in Brazil. So let's say my son wanted to go in that direction. Knowing Portuguese, you'd give him an advantage,
right,
with that company. So just on that it gives our children a comparative advantage in the global market should be sufficient for us to really want to promote Portuguese with our children. Right. Beyond, of course, wanting them to keep our heritage and our culture.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So we've covered, I think, some of this, so nothing big there. Citizenship status. So quite, citizenship is very strong, I think, within the community.
Yes. In our survey, 80% of the people that were born outside of the United States have U.S. citizenship. And in the Census Bureau, they say that of those born in Portugal, 70% have citizenship in the United States. And this is much higher than for other immigrant groups, but, they are much more recent than we are. We are, of the Portuguese population, almost 90% arrived in the United States before 2000, whereas the figure is about 55,000 of all immigrants in the United States arrived before 2000. So as you can see, we are an old group. Right. By comparison.
Right. So we kind of covered this already. I don't know if you want. Yeah. Okay. And citizenship by generation. So again, nothing too surprising here. Though I will say we do see a lot more people wanting to get their dual citizenship with Portugal these days. So that's become something that.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that people wrote in the comments, the spaces where we allowed them to write in comments in the survey. Is that you'd like that process to be easier.
Yeah. That's a whole other discussion. Yeah. Portuguese elections. So, I mean, this is something that I don't know that a lot of people in the community even know about or know that it's possible once you become a citizen of Portugal.
they can vote for the president of Portugal as well as for the parliament. But there is very low participation in Portuguese elections. And I really think that this is something we need to work on, because it's a right that we have. We have a right to participate in the politics of Portugal. And if we are going to be called a diaspora, then we really need to increase our participation in Portuguese society itself.
Right. And I think some of that has to do with that you have to go to the consulate to vote. So it might be difficult for people to do that. So yeah.
I live in Indiana. I voted in Portuguese elections because I live in Indiana.
Right.
So how do we make it possible for people like me to vote in Portuguese elections?
Exactly. On the flip side, though, as we mentioned earlier, participation in the U.S. political system, we're actually doing quite well there. We vote regularly. Yes. We call our elected officials. We even contribute to campaigns. So we're pretty active in public service, I would say.
And this was confirmed also by the studies done on citizenship and voting behavior of the Portuguese by that citizen group. I don't remember their name exactly, but they did some studies a decade ago or so. So
okay, that's good to know. Good to know. Good to know when we're calling our congressman, and we can say we represent a very politically active community, right?
Yes.
And then, we're not going to go through all the numbers here, but for those who want to take a look, within the states, the number of Portuguese by district, so that you can see, do you live in a district that has a high Portuguese population, and does your representative, they should know that, right? And are they aware of that? So these are the key people that need to be on our radar politically. And obviously not all of them are Portuguese, right? I think we have 3 Portuguese congressmen. But
there was a time when we had 4 from California.
Right. So again, just these are names that are important to know. Now we get into the community portion of the discussion. Do people consider themselves to be a part of a community, and what are the issues that are important to them? So happy to see that a good portion, 75% of the people consider themselves to be part of a community. So that was encouraging to see.
Yes, and studies have shown that the descendants of immigrant groups generally stick around the areas into which the immigrant generation settled, and much more than it was expected. The theory expected that as people became integrated in American society, then they'd have the same mobility patterns as the rest of the American population. But studies have shown that even the Irish and the Italians have tended to stay within the states where that first generation came in the 19th and 20th century. And the Portuguese show the same pattern as well. Although we are increasingly moving into other areas, as that previous chart showed, in Virginia, Washington state,
right,
and other states, North Carolina, Texas, and so on.
Right.
But still remain very concentrated in the areas where our immigrant ancestors settled.
And this was an interesting one. Some surprises here, some not. But I think the number one challenge was really no surprise, that just getting more people involved in community organizations. That just seems to be, no matter what state you live in or what community you're part of, that's a biggie. It's a big one.
Yes, and from the comments that people wrote in the open-ended question areas, this came out as our community being at the crossroads. I mean, and the reason is that, as I said before, immigration from Portugal is decreasing. The immigrant generation that's here is aging. So, what about our future as a group that's distinct within American society? How are we going to be able to continue to exist as this separate and distinct group, not separate, but distinct group. And the major concern that people add is how we have so many organizations and they are so divided among themselves. How do we make sure that these organizations survive into the future? And, with the older generation, immigrant generation retiring, these organizations have to be taken up by the children. So how do we get the children interested in these organizations? And how do we then transmit our culture to them so that we continue having our culture here and being reproduced here? And again, returning to that idea of diaspora, if we cannot maintain our culture and our organizations, our organizational density across the generations, from generation to generation, then we are not a diaspora. We are an immigrant group on its way into assimilation into American society. So if we're going to call ourselves a diaspora, then that survival of our culture, the continued replication of our culture, the continued vibrancy of our organizations must be ensured. And there is a lot of generational conflict between the older folks and the younger people. The younger people want, they want to leave the traditional culture that was practiced in the villages in Portugal, the Azores and Madeira behind, and adopt modern, contemporary Portuguese culture. Maybe they want to Americanize the organizations. And so there's a little intergenerational conflict there in terms of these organizations. And but we have to be able to pass the organizations and the leadership of the organizations to the American-born generations, if those are going to survive and if we are to call ourselves a diaspora. Otherwise, we just melt into American society.
Right. You know what I thought was interesting is the comparison between the item that says maintaining the Portuguese culture, the blue bar, which is not a big challenge. It's a moderate challenge, but compared to, getting more involved in the community and maintaining the language, it's interesting that that you would think that maintaining the culture would also be a big challenge. But my theory, and this is just a personal theory, so please don't assign this to the PALCUS, belief system or anything like that. But just from what I've observed and people that I know is that there are a lot of people that, have the cookbooks and cook the food and listen to the music or, visit Portugal, but it's all on their own. It's not necessarily tied to an organization. So I feel like people feel they have more resources to maintain their culture, maintain the Portuguese culture, whether it's on their own or whether it's with friends or whatever, but they almost feel like maybe they don't need the organization to do that. I think the organization is more about the community aspect and coming together and being around other Portuguese. And, if people are viewing that as not as important, why is that? And how can we, make that an important thing? To your point, that if we are going to be considered a diaspora, how do we maintain that? So I thought that was an interesting comparison to look at those two charts.
Well, but there were complaints about, the culture that they want us to add is that traditional nostalgia type of culture, and we are more interested in the new things that are happening in Portugal. And but the old people don't want us to engage in that or within the organizations. So there's things to think about and either in these regards.
These are some of the comments that you were talking about. So, and I will just say that we had over 1,200 respondents, so there were 1,200 comments that we certainly couldn't list here. So this just, summarizes a lot of the repeated ones. But yeah, no, I actually love going through the comments. I think it's so insightful and so interesting. This one I was also not surprised that, the challenges in my community is probably very similar to what's happening in New Jersey or Massachusetts. I wasn't too surprised here. Any surprises for you, Dulce, on this one?
No, no.
Yeah. So when it comes to personal and economic concerns, I loved asking these questions because I think these are some of the things that we've never asked our community, right? Like
Never.
yeah. So cost of education, absolutely. That was I took the survey and that was my biggest one. I will tell you right now. Access to healthcare and retirement, and I don't know, did we do any comparison on how these compare to just general concerns of Americans in general?
These are similar to the general concerns of Americans.
Yeah.
But also, this group was highly educated, and there were a significant number of people that were already retired. So getting help, getting a job, or lack of information about starting a business was not a major concern for them.
Right.
They had more concerns about retirement, about Social Security and Medicare, and of course, cost of education, etc.
Right. I will just do a plug for foreign education, just from a cost perspective, that if you do have Portuguese citizenship, or actually even if you don't, the cost of going to university over there is considerably cheaper than it is even for a state school. Here in California. So definitely something to consider for your children, or encourage them to think about it, because the education, I think, is just as good, if not better, in some of the universities over there. And when you're looking at $5,000 a year versus $45,000 a year or more, that's a big difference. Something to consider. Social and political concerns. This was another great one. I was so happy to see we got some data on this, and some surprises. I was actually interesting to see that terrorism ranked number 3 as a top concern. I didn't think that would rank so highly, but it did. No surprise that the political leadership, that's just top of mind for everybody, right?
And that's similar to all Americans. In fact, the Gallup poll that I cite there, that was the biggest concern of Americans. It was higher than the economic concerns that Americans have, in general. So, of course, if we were at a different time with a different political leadership, that might not be a major concern.
Right.
That's dependent on the times that we are living now.
Right. And not so surprising that immigration issues, whether it was the U.S. limiting immigration or the lack of control over illegal immigration, wasn't surprising that didn't rank so highly, again, because our community has been here so long, and there just isn't the wave of immigration coming from Portugal like there used to be. So it would be natural that that's not a huge concern. Correct?
Yes, although there's still some good concern about that. I mean, the concern for Portuguese Americans is that with limitations to immigration, we are not going to get new immigrants from Portugal, or we're going to get very few immigrants from Portugal. Right. And it is good for the survival of our communities if we get fresh batches of immigrants. Right.
So this was interesting too, just reading some of the other concerns, that didn't make it on the actual chart, but, you have the gun control problem, the drug epidemic, things like that, how Portuguese are labeled on the census form. And I will just do another little plug here. That's something that PALCUS is working on, to provide some education to the community on how do you fill out the census form if you want to be counted as Portuguese, because there's the short form and the long form, and they can be a little confusing. So we'll be working on that to address that issue as well.
And a plug-in for the survey we did a few years
ago. Oh,
back.
yes, that's right, which you also helped us with, which...
and in which people overwhelmingly rejected the idea that the census would label Portuguese as Latinos or Hispanics.
Hispanics, right. And as a result of that survey, the Census Bureau abandoned the idea. And so...
and that survey is being cited in a lot of places because we had a biracial category.
Yep.
And multiracial category. And so one place where I found that study cited was in studies related to biracial populations in America.
Mm-hmm.
They actually thanked us for including biracial as a question, including the race of the persons as a question in the survey.
Right, right. Well, I would say that was thanks to you because you helped us to design that survey. So that was a good call on your part. So this is also another good one because as our organizations think about how do we engage our current members, how do we get new members, what kind of, why aren't people coming to the festa anymore? So this was really important to see, are people spending time at their church, with their kids, doing sports? I mean, these are things that we've speculated, but it was nice to see some of that information validated, and then even some other surprises, right? So,
Yeah.
A lot of people are being physically fit and dedicating time to exercise and or doing sports activities that are not related to things Portuguese. Some people are volunteering with a local Portuguese organization, some are not. So I think it would, we can go through all of these, but it was really interesting, and I would encourage.
And we need to revise this question because a lot of the questions ask about children, and so a lot of our respondents did not have young children, so these questions didn't really apply to them.
No, that's a really great point.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. And the next one. So you just talked about that. And so there is also genealogy and other hobbies and other cultural activities, that sort of thing. So
yes, and people wrote that they are really interested in their genealogy and they've traveled to Portugal or they try to get records through the internet, but the records are in Portuguese and a lot of us do not speak English, right?
Uh-huh.
And so, do not speak Portuguese.
Right.
And so there was like, oh, it would be so good if these records were translated into English, birth records, etc. Also, they'd like those records to be more available and more uniform throughout, which probably is difficult to do when we're looking at people in the 19th and 18th and 17th century. But all the churches in all the little towns have records, the baptism records that can be used. Right. And it would be great if really there was easier access to those.
Right. I think that's definitely something that I know lots of different universities and other organizations are working on. But that's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of records, if not millions.
Yes,
that's a big job.
Yeah.
As far as where people would like to see more investment of time and money in our community. Again, really helpful to see. And I would love for organizations to use this data when looking at their activities for the year. Portuguese language classes or helping getting your children to college or university. Something simple as what's the application process and how long does it take? And because even though we have a lot more people going to college, maybe their parents didn't go to college yet. And so they're not familiar with the process. So I think some of these indications are really, really important.
Yes.
Let's see, do we have some comments? Yep, other things like making travel a little bit easier. Well, I think that has to do with the airline, but because it's pretty,
it's getting competition.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get there these days. This is an interesting one, facilitating cultural and academic exchanges with Portugal, mentoring for Portuguese-American youth. So there's a lot of really great ideas here. Again, that I hope that a lot of the organizations and even, PALCUS is using this information to set our agenda for our programs for next year. Our community has told us what's important to them. So those are the issues we're going to focus on. So I definitely hope people use this information. This was interesting. Where are they donating their charitable, their funding? Do they give to Portuguese causes or non-Portuguese causes? And I like to see that people regularly give or sometimes give, and that the never give is a really low number. And I think that's just very consistent with our community, right? As we as a people, we're a very giving community. And then, you know, about the same to Portuguese and non-Portuguese causes, you know, we split the difference, especially those of us.
Some people that live far away from any Portuguese community, it's more difficult for them to give to Portuguese causes. And if they lived in the Portuguese community, they might be more inclined to favor Portuguese causes.
Right. But I think this is encouraging for those organizations looking for donations and, you know, the community to help them survive. The people are open to it, right? So it's not that people aren't giving. People are definitely open to it. And this was really insightful too, right? Where do people, is it your church? Is it your education funds? National fund drives like the American Cancer Fund, things like that. So I think that was, again, information that will help our organizations figure out where they should.
The highest category is clubs or organizations to which I belong, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's encouraging, right? So, and then giving by income level, and that's not surprising, right? I think that's probably very much in line with any group, and even America in general, right? The more you make, the more you give.
Yes, although the middle class is more likely to give a higher percentage of their income than rich people. but it could be that rich people are still giving more. It's just that it's a lower percentage.
That's right. Visits to Portugal. So this was great. I loved seeing this, and I attribute this to the fact that it's just definitely easier to get there, right? You know, flying. And
well, also people have more income. You know, we are a wealthy group in American society, fairly wealthy society.
So this was good, and I even find that I was surprised to see that like the third and fourth generations, there was such a high percentage of never, because I feel like I know a lot of third and fourth generations that have at least been once because they wanted to reconnect with their roots. So I was really surprised to see that number, but happy to see that in general people are still visiting Portugal.
Yeah.
And then the reasons, of course, vacation and tourism, that would be great. Though I think we did ask some questions about, you know, are you going to be doing some business? Like those slides are coming up.
Yeah.
So a lot of people went recently. Yeah, I feel like everybody was in the islands this summer. Everybody I knew was there.
It feels that way every time I'm there, that everyone from America is there.
This one I was happy to see, and I wasn't so surprised because of, you know, Portugal's been in the news a lot, in travel magazines and in investment property magazines. It's like the hot destination to be. You know, it's like the new Silicon Valley of Europe. And, you know, so buying property there, you can get it for, I don't want to say cheap because it's really not cheap anymore, but, you know, it's certainly more affordable than buying in Silicon Valley. But yeah, definitely glad to see that people are looking at having a permanent presence there through property purchase. And then business investments too, I thought was really interesting. So people are looking, you know, across the pond, not just locally. So that was interesting. This one, I don't know if did we have any comments from this one? No, I don't think so, but the Portuguese-American media. So for, you know, in California, we only have one newspaper, and some of us have RTP, not all of us. So we don't get a whole lot of Portuguese media out here. So it was interesting to see for this one.
Yeah, and the Portuguese-American TV stations are in Massachusetts, right?
Right.
And there's one in Massachusetts. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of people don't watch it because a large percentage of the people in our survey are from California.
Right, right. So definitely there's an opportunity, I think, for more Portuguese programming, whether it's, you know, published, you know, from the local state, or we just have it more accessible, you know, more.
Yeah. Portugal. And another issue related to these is that has been discussed before is it worthwhile putting subtitles in Portuguese language programs so that people that don't speak Portuguese can enjoy them?
Right, that's a great point.
That's a discussion, and you know, of course, the cost involved in doing that.
Yeah,
is high.
I just did a quick time check and we're actually coming up on the hour, but I mean, I think let's just keep going and try and get through as much as we can.
Yeah, let's just very quickly go through it.
That's not a surprise, social media. This is also not a surprise in terms of the uses, keeping in touch with family and friends, and finding out information about Portugal. So that's no big surprise there. And then these were just general questions about PALCUS. And I think this was very insightful for us that, you know, some people know about us, some people don't. And there are a lot of our programs that people just don't know about. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of promotion of our programs, even educational programs like the internship and scholarship and our mentoring program and, you know, the exchange program. So there's so many things that we do. It's really hard to really get the word out. So we have our work cut out for us. And I would encourage those of you listening to check out our website and look into it because it's actually really a lot of good stuff and a lot of it's free. So, you know, it's meant to be a resource for the community. And if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter or become a member, please do so. It's very easy and you can do so online. So now let's get into the conclusion of you know, what we discovered and how we're going to move forward.
Okay, go ahead, Angela.
Oh no, I was going to turn it over to you.
A lot of the things that are in the conclusion, we already talked about them. That's and essentially is what can we do to maintain, as we integrate into American society, what can we do to maintain our community as a distinct group within America, to remain a diaspora rather than totally melt into the American mainstream. Mm-hmm. And so how can we then pass the culture and the organizational leadership to the next generation? Can we do anything to maybe unite these organizations? People complain about a lot of divisiveness in the Portuguese communities, not just from organization to organization, but also from place of origin, being from the continent versus being from the Azores, and within Azores, which island you come from, being from Madeira, and so on. So those are challenges for the entire community, and in particular for Portuguese-American organizations, because they are the ones that do the most to carry our culture forward and to imprint Portuguese America in the entire fabric of American culture. So you know, I think it is good news that our community is doing so well in America. Mm-hmm. That we are fully integrated and accepted as a group in this country, and we need to continue moving forward, being successful, doing well, but we also need to face the challenge of maintaining, reproducing our Portuguese-American culture from generation to generation, as well as maintain our very important community organizations.
Right, and I think that's something that we all need to think about in terms of what is our contribution going to be to that, right? Because, you know, we fully understand that not everybody's going to play in a band, not everybody's going to dance folklore, and not everybody's going to march in a parade. But is there something else that you would like to see so that when your child has a festa to go to, and maybe it's not the festa that you grew up with, maybe it looks a little different, but it still has the elements of the Portuguese culture, the food, the music, you know, the art and those sorts of things, both as a child and then as adults. They have a social outlet to, you know, connect with other Portuguese, you know, because there is that instant connection that you have when you meet another Portuguese person, right? Yes. There's some things that you just immediately have in common. And so, you know, unfortunately, I think a lot of people just think that it will always be there because it always has been there. But we're reaching a point in our community that we all have a role to play in maintaining it in some way. So how are you going to do that? You know,
I mean, it's Portuguese American culture is still very vibrant in California, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, but we can't really take it for granted that it's going to be always so, and we need to take the steps to make sure that it is continued into the American-born generations.
Right. No.
And let me just say also something else.
Mm-hmm.
The second most common way of learning Portuguese is through going to Portugal. And I think it would be really worthwhile. I know that RIC, for example, and some universities in California take kids to Portugal. But it should be really important that we encourage that and that we spend more resources on that to make it possible for our kids to go study in Portugal, and maybe even bring kids from Portugal over here to events where they're going to participate together with our children.
No, I agree 100%. And just from my personal experience, I never took Portuguese classes, really. I've learned most of what I know by going to Portugal. And our friends and family that are there, while they understand English, they don't really like to use it, or they would just, it's easier for them. So I have to speak Portuguese. That's how I've learned. Yeah. So if I had the opportunity when I was in school to actually go and study there, it would be completely different for me. Yeah, I feel like I would be a lot more fluent than I am. So thus going back to the, you mentioned study abroad, send your kids to college there, not just for a semester, but all 4 years. That's my vote. That's my vote.
Oh, not my baby. I'm not going to let I'm just saying what some mothers will say to them.
Right. Well, this has been incredible. I love the information that we got. I look forward to the next one, and implementing a methodology that allows us to have an even bigger, more representative sample, and then comparing the data at that point. And I really hope that some of the organizations out there use this information to help plan their activities and really get some insight into the minds of their members and the community and people they're trying to reach, because we have to change with the times if we're going to maintain our culture and maintain our community as a united, strong community. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of Portuguese people that are living in American society, right? We're not an actual community. So thank you for those of us that have joined us today, and for those of you who are listening to this, post live session. Thank you again, Dulce, for all your work. Amazing, incredible work. And we could not have done it without you.
I really enjoy learning anything about our community. So that's why I decided that I was going to definitely be involved in this.
Yeah, no, it was really great to work with you. You're fabulous. And so
you are fabulous too, Angela. It's like, you have an incredible amount of leadership skills, and I really think you are a great leader of this organization. So I'm really glad that you have taken, that you give so much to this organization, and you care so much about the Portuguese community, especially when you are fourth generation Portuguese.
I know. It's my passion. It's everybody has a cause at some point, and the community has become my cause. So thank you. This recording will be on our YouTube channel as well as our website. So please visit our website. And if you have any questions, suggestions, if you'd like to volunteer, anything like that, we are here for you. So please let us know. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. So until next time, Dulce, thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving.
You're welcome. And we'll be talking with you soon.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.